Gurv Mila Mahagut, Catherine, and thank you all for turning out today. I have to say it is quite humbling for me to have to be here and to follow the incredible talent that has been displayed before us, but also the inspiring, ever wonderful Bernadette. I always come to these meetings and I go, oh, for Christ's sake, why did I let her speak first? But such is the way of the world. And while thanking ye, I have to warn ye, as Catherine hinted, that I don't know if ye all know it, but actually the fact of your very presence here is sufficient evidence for the Irish Times to deduce that ye are all, in fact, Russian spies. That's all it takes. That's all it takes. You're now linked to me. But if you're waiting for that checkbook from the Kremlin or the free trip to Moscow, I'm sorry, but you'll have to wait a bit longer because I haven't even got that yet. But look as a Kildare woman, I have to say I'm very glad to be especially glad here to mark St. Bridget's Day. A day to remember the women who won't be silenced. The women who aren't afraid to swim against the tide. The women who've taken wallops for it, quite literally. We are here to pay our respects to all of the women who've resisted. Those whose names we know, but especially those whose names we don't know. The thousands upon thousands of women in this country who in their daily lives push back and always have throughout history. Push back against the chains binding them, policing them, disciplining them. And I think it's the hope of everyone here to do everything we can to take our place among them. And as the others have said, we're also here a little bit to talk about heresies, to talk about the frame of the accepted and what's involved in shifting it. Because what's heretical today is common sense tomorrow. And we've seen that over and over again in this country. When it comes to abortion, divorce, same-sex marriage, women's right to work, unplanned pregnancies, and on it goes. But the shifting of the frame didn't happen organically. It didn't drop out of the sky. It didn't happen by a revelation. It took work. Years of back-breaking work, of organising and shouting and resisting. It took us 35 years to repeal the Eighth Amendment. And I remember being a student leader after its introduction, when we were spreading student abortion information, and I see some people from that campaign here. We were murderers, condemned from the altar, threatened with imprisonment and with fines. And then lo and behold, in the last few years, when those who had stood in our way elbowed us out of that way to claim the glory as the boulder went down the hill. It was the same again when we lifted the lid on Garda corruption. When the tide turned and Maurice McCabe's revelations looked like they were going to bring down a minister or a Garda commissioner or two, everybody was swimming with us. But it wasn't like that in the early days, when the media wrote articles about us undermining the valiant men and women who stood on the streets and gave their lives for Ireland. It wasn't like that when Garda officials went with insidious threats about being very careful, or when Mick Wallace's information was released to the Garda Commissioner and to the Minister for Justice, or I was arrested on the side of the road in the middle of the night, handcuffed, and the information of my alleged, not true, drink driving leaked to the newspapers. But it was ever so. We know that. Threats, smears, insinuations, scandals, they're all used to silence and sideline dissent, to push political views and actions out of the realm of what's acceptable into the morally suspect. We know that, but I have to say, nothing prepared me for what was going to happen when I went to the European Parliament, because it was there that I became a fully fledged heretic. And I'm very, very glad that there hasn't been burning at the stake, because if there was, I wouldn't be here with you today. And what was our heinous crime? Well, against the backdrop of rampaging militarisation being whipped up across the EU, we argued for de-escalation. I've told the story before about a Security and Defence Committee, when a big Polish fella turned on me and said I'd some neck arguing for peace against Russia when Russia never invaded us and when we were very lucky on the other side of Europe. And I answered him by saying, yeah, you're absolutely right, but you know what? We too were invaded by somebody just as bad, and they stayed a lot longer, but I don't hear any of ye in here arguing to arm the IRA in case they come back. No, you didn't. You argued for peace. You said we had to live with our neighbours, and that's what ye have to do as well. And when Putin gave them everything they wanted, responded to the provocation and invaded Ukraine, we called for peace and a negotiated settlement. Oh my God, how could we? Why would we do such a thing? Could it be that we were anti-war activists? We'd broken into Shannon after all to search US military planes. I called Barack Obama a war criminal and a hypocrite of the century when he was here before. Could that be the reason? Could it be that we looked at every war in history and found out that wars are not sorted and stopped by more war, but by peace? For God's sake, it couldn't be that. Sure, the only reason it had to be is that we absolutely love Putin. And at best, we were doing it because we're useless idiots, or useful idiots, maybe useless as well. But at worst, because we're in the pay of the Kremlin. And we have had serious journalists in the Business Post put that to me. Well, how else would your position be rationalised? This is a completely illegitimate view. And we were demonised because we were calling them out to their face in the heart of the EU itself. And this was intolerable and unforgivable. And one of the biggest slurs that they singled against us time after time is that we were 2 of 13 people who stood against the European Parliament, who stood against the herd, and that, not the content of why we voted against, but that we dared to be different, was enough to slander us. And I have to say, there is a certain type of person in this country. They're overrepresented in the media, in the political establishment, even among some universities and on social media, and these people love the European Union. They are the ancestors of those who doffed the cap to the British Registrant Magistrate. They are the ones who want the US coming in here, giving us jobs, because how could the Paddies ever create jobs for themselves? They're embarrassed to be Irish. They were scarlet that the people actually dared not once but twice and 3 times to vote against Nice and Lisbon. They are shamed by that, because for them, a European politician is automatically more reliable, more insightful, more astute than any Irish politician ever could have been in history. And there's been so many articles written, especially by our friends in the Irish Times, but one of them really struck me. And it was one of the regulars where we were, an embarrassment and a disgrace and, all the rest of it. And they quoted this Latvian MEP, and he agreed. He thought we were stark raving mad altogether. And of course, he must have been right, because we're scraggy ruffians and he was a man in a suit. But if they'd bothered to Google search this individual, they would have seen a man who was sacked as the mayor of Riga for massive corruption in public procurement contracts. They would have seen a man who headhunted and witch-hunted a journalist who criticised him, who had him imprisoned, and that journalist was later shot. That man had to resign. But his word stood, because he was European and we weren't. And the demonisation and the vilification followed. The emails, the abuse, time and again. And there was one day I was on the street and all of that was at its height, and a man was screaming at me for being a Putin puppet. But what really registered with me was, at the same time, 2 other men came up to me quietly, and I still think about it because they were bad times, to thank us for the work that we did. And it made me realise that making us heretics wasn't about us. It was about silencing all of the other people who dared to hope in a better world. All of the people, the staff in the European Parliament, who day after day come up and say, thank God there's someone talking for peace. the letters we get from every corner of Europe, but you read the rags in this place and you're supposed to be demoralized into thinking that there is no alternative. Now fast forward on 2 years and the whole of the world now can see the European Union in all of its genocidal glory for exactly what it is. Proud genocide herself tells us that Europe stands with Israel now and in the days to come. She drapes European buildings with the Israeli flag. Her words are cited by Israel in the International Criminal Court to support their defense of the charge of genocide. They've tried to stop the funding to starving Palestinians, whose future and destiny people all over Europe and the world are looking at in horror. We can't believe the scenes we're witnessing. Children, adults, men and women, all innocents, dead, houses destroyed, hospitals targeted, universities we never thought we'd see the likes of it before. And yet the European institutions have yet to have a minute's silence for Palestinian victims. They've had one for Israel. They had the Israeli ambassador in. And when we asked, could we have one for Palestine as well, we were told this is no time for whataboutism. That was on the 10th of October. It's been no time for the following Palestinian victims in the months that have followed either. And now we find ourselves again in a minority, where this time we were 2 out of 20. The numbers are going up a bit slow on the uptake, to stand against a resolution in the European Parliament. But you don't see any headlines about the crime of us being in a minority, because they know full well that the Irish people would not tolerate that there is an instinctive support and sympathy for the people of Palestine as a result of our colonial history. We will not be smeared and intimidated by ridiculous claims of anti-Semitism when we are rightfully criticising the Zionist project of Israel. So they can't do that stunt against us this time. They can't say, oh, well, they're in a minority. Isn't that terrible? No, that doesn't work this time with Ireland. So what's the outcome? They ignore us. The European Parliament discusses a disgraceful amendment which basically agrees that there can be a ceasefire in Israel over 3 months into the genocide only if Hamas is dismantled and all the hostages are released. So in other words, the terms at which Netanyahu himself has outlined and the Israelis themselves celebrated that outcome. What does RTE do? It plays the speech of Sean Kelly, which I have to say is a Fine Gael MEP from Kerry. It was probably the worst speech of all of the Irish politicians, and he was one of the ones who supported that genocidal clause, but they didn't cover that. I made a speech at that time calling out the Irish-American roots of Joe Biden, pointing out to him that he couldn't claim to be Irish and yet support genocide. That speech went viral everywhere. We know that Newsweek asked Biden's office to comment on the fact that an Irish MEP had the audacity to say that his ancestors disowned him. Newsweek could cover it. Not a single media outlet in Ireland covered any of that information. So that's what we're up against. Sometimes the heresy isn't the fact of being in the minority. Actually, what matters is who you're disagreeing with and their ruthlessness and their degree of commitment in seeing you silenced. And the truth and the message that we want to take out from this gathering here today is that it is those in power in the EU and in the US who are the minority. They are the ones who are keeping the genocide in Gaza going. They are the ones, that tiny, tiny minority in the United Nations who time and again voted to stop the diplomatic efforts to end the war in Ukraine. They're the tiny minority who vote to keep unilateral sanctions against countries who they declare to be enemies. But now everyone can see that they are against international law, they're against the United Nations Charter, they're against what our Constitution calls for, which is the peaceful resolutions of disputes. And the people all over the world, in the countries that contain the majority of the world's population, but also in the US and EU, see them for what they are. The Zionist project is over. It's over. And it's utterly devastating that it's coming at such a phenomenal cost to innocent men, women and children in Gaza and Palestine. But there's no going back for them now. They've lost that support. Things will never be the same again. So we're here to say we will not be smeared. We will not be silenced by ridiculous narratives. We have the European Parliament meeting next week in Strasbourg. Do you know what? There's not a single item on Gaza on the agenda. Instead, there's Russiagate, the threat of infiltration of the European Parliament of Russia. What a load of absolute nonsense. These people will stop at nothing to shift the balance of their own culpability. But we are here to say we will not let that happen. We're Irish, we are European, we're international, and we're proud of it. And we are unique in our history, in our legacy of St. Bridget, in our legacy of rebel women who always stood against the tide. That we are glad to be different. We're proud to be different because we don't want to be part of a world dominated by the global north where militarism and might is right. That's not what we want. Our affinity lies with the global south, with the oppressed peoples, and we will use every might in our being